He was a billionaire used to controlling everything, until an 8-year-old girl in a denim dress looked him dead in the eyes and said, "Don't drink the coffee. She's trying to kill you." What followed wasn't just an attempted murder. It was a betrayal from inside his own home, a secret war between corporations, and the unexpected beginning of a love story no one saw coming. The sun poured over the California hills like honey, casting a golden light across the manicured grounds of the Weston estate. At the highest point of the property stood the mansion, sleek, modern, and silent, its glass and steel facade gleaming in the late morning light. Inside, all was quiet, save for the subtle hum of air conditioning and the distant clink of cutlery being polished in the kitchen. Alexander Weston stood in his private study, the floor-to-ceiling windows framing him like a painting. His tailored light suit fit him perfectly, the pale fabric offsetting his warm brown eyes and the neatly styled dark brown hair that curled slightly at his temples. At 35, he was already a legend in the business world, a self-made tech mogul, CEO of Weston Dynamics, known for his intellect, discipline, and a charisma that seemed both effortless and unreachable. He ended a call with his legal team and leaned back in the leather chair, exhaling slowly. The upcoming deal with the Department of Defense was the biggest in the company's history. Billions were on the table, and rivals were circling like sharks. He felt the pressure behind his eyes, dull and constant, but he welcomed it. Pressure meant progress. As he checked his watch, a soft knock came at the door. "Mr. Weston, your lunch is ready," came the voice of Elena, the head housekeeper. But it wasn't Elena who had caught his attention lately. It was Emma. Downstairs, in the quiet hum of the kitchen, Emma Lawrence wiped her hands on her apron and glanced at her daughter, Lily, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor, humming to herself as she drew with crayons. Emma was only 30, but her eyes carried more life than her age suggested. A widow for nearly 4 years, she had taken the job at the Weston estate after losing nearly everything. Once a bank analyst, now she changed linens and scrubbed marble floors. The job was honest, and it came with a roof over their heads. That was more than she'd had before. Emma brushed a strand of hair from her face. Her dark waves were tied into a simple ponytail, and the deep blue of her eyes contrasted sharply with the faded gray of her uniform. She was beautiful, though she didn't see it anymore, not in the way she used to. "Mommy, can I come with you upstairs?" Lily asked, her brown eyes wide and hopeful. "Not right now, sweetheart. Mr. Weston is eating. But I'll be quiet." Emma smiled softly and shook her head. "Later, okay? Go finish your flowers." Lily pouted but turned back to her drawing. As Emma headed down the hallway, she passed by Scarlett Blake, Alexander's new secretary. The woman looked like she belonged on the cover of a fashion magazine, tall, stunningly blonde, with sharp features and a wardrobe that screamed power. She walked with the kind of confidence that came from knowing she was admired. Or feared. "Emma," Scarlett said with a too-sweet smile. "Mr. Weston asked for his coffee. I'll bring it up." Emma hesitated. "Elena usually does that." Scarlett shrugged. "Well, I'm here now. Might as well make myself useful." Emma said nothing. Something about the woman unsettled her, but it wasn't her place to question. Not here. Not in this world. Minutes later, Alexander sat at the dining table, reviewing emails on his tablet. The room was quiet, peaceful, he appreciated that. Scarlett entered gracefully, her heels barely making a sound against the hardwood floor. She carried a silver tray with a delicate white porcelain cup. "Your coffee, sir," she said with a subtle smile, placing it in front of him. He gave her a nod, barely looking up. Just as his hand reached for the cup, there was the patter of small footsteps, rushed and urgent, and then the dining room door flew open. "Uncle Alex." Lily's voice rang out, breathless. "Don't drink that. She put something in it." Alexander froze. Scarlett turned sharply, her expression flickering between confusion and annoyance. "What?" Emma ran in seconds later, her eyes wide with horror. Lily. What are you doing? I'm so sorry, Mr. Weston, But Lily was insistent. She had a little bottle. She dripped something in your coffee. I saw her do it when you weren't there. The silence that followed was immediate and suffocating. Alexander slowly lowered the cup, now inches from his lips, and looked between the girl, her mother, and the woman who had just served him. Scarlett's smile returned, though it didn't reach her eyes. She's just a kid. Probably saw me adding cream or sugar. No, Lily said, her voice trembling. It was black. In a dropper. Like medicine. And she looked around before she did it. Emma pulled Lily to her, whispering in panic, "Honey, stop, don't say another word." But Alexander stood. The tension in the room shifted instantly. He wasn't a man who often raised his voice. He didn't need to. "Scarlett," he said quietly. "Step away from the table. No one leaves this house until I get answers." Scarlett's face paled slightly, but she nodded and moved back. He looked at his security guard, who had stepped into the room during the commotion. "Send the coffee to the lab," Alexander said coldly. "And keep an eye on everyone. Especially her." Scarlett opened her mouth to protest but thought better of it. Emma clutched Lily tightly, shaking. She didn't understand what had just happened. Neither did Alexander. But something told him the little girl's voice may have just saved his life. And everything had just changed. The silence that settled over the dining room was not ordinary. It was the kind of silence that crackles, tense, electric, the breathless moment before a storm breaks. Alexander Weston stood motionless, the untouched porcelain cup still steaming faintly before him. His brown eyes locked onto the 8-year-old girl clinging to her mother's hand, her face pale but firm. Lily didn't blink. The air felt thick. Emma, clutching her daughter, seemed frozen between apology and disbelief. She wanted to pull Lily out of the room, to somehow undo the last few minutes, but she couldn't move. Her heart pounded. Her thoughts raced. What had her daughter just done? Scarlett Blake, the secretary, stood several feet away, stiff, composed, her hands still at her sides. Her bright red lips parted slightly, as if trying to decide whether to laugh or to retaliate. "Sir," she finally said, her tone cool but practiced. "Surely you're not taking this seriously. She's a child." Alexander's eyes never left Lily's. "What did you see?" Lily swallowed hard but didn't look away. "She had a little bottle. It was in her purse. I saw her open your coffee cup and drip something into it when no one was in the room." "And how do you know it wasn't sugar or milk?" "It was in a dropper," Lily whispered. "And she looked scared when she did it. She kept looking over her shoulder." Alexander exhaled slowly and turned to his head of security, Mason King, who stood quietly at the doorway. Mason was tall and broad, with a military background and a calm that made him seem almost invisible until needed. "Get the cup tested immediately," Alexander said. "Call in our private chem team, tell them it's priority 1. And keep Miss Blake in the house until we get the results. No one leaves." "Yes, sir," Mason responded, already reaching for his phone. Scarlett's mask began to slip. "With all due respect, Mr. Weston, this is insane. You're going to detain me based on the fantasy of an unsupervised child." "You're not being detained," Alexander replied evenly. "You're being asked to stay. And if you refuse, I'll have you escorted off the premises. The authorities will be notified either way." Her cheeks flushed, though whether with fear or rage, it wasn't clear. "You're going to trust her over me?" Alexander turned to her slowly. "I don't know what's in that cup, Miss Blake. But I do know one thing, children have no reason to lie like this unless they're afraid." He turned back to Emma and Lily, who now looked like she wanted to melt into her mother's arms. Emma was still in shock, her mind struggling to grasp the enormity of the moment. Her daughter had just accused a corporate executive of attempted poisoning, of murder. Alexander's voice softened. "Emma, may I speak to Lily alone?" Emma looked alarmed but nodded slowly. "I'll be right outside the door." She led Lily over to one of the lounge chairs in the adjacent sitting area, and Alexander pulled one of the smaller armchairs closer to her. He crouched down so they were eye level. For a moment, he didn't say anything. "Lily," he said at last, his voice low. "It's very important that you tell me the truth. Not just because I'm asking, but because it might help me." Lily nodded, her small hands twisting in her lap. "You said you saw Scarlett put something in my coffee. Where were you standing?" "I was hiding behind the curtain," she said. "I like pretending it's a cape. I saw her go into the room with your cup." She looked around like she was making sure no one was watching. Then she took out a tiny black bottle. It had no label. Alexander's heart beat faster. What did she do with it? She opened the lid of the coffee and dropped in. "I don't know. A few drops." She closed it really fast and wiped the top with a napkin. Then she fixed her hair in the mirror and walked away like nothing happened. "Did she see you?" Lily hesitated. "I don't think so. I stayed very still." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You did the right thing. I want you to know that. You were very brave." Lily bit her lip. "Am I in trouble?" He shook his head. "No. You might have saved my life." She looked down at her shoes. "She's very pretty. I didn't think pretty people were bad." Alexander almost smiled, but the weight of the moment pushed the expression down. He stood, his face now hardening. He turned to Mason, who had just received a call. Mason's voice was tight. "Initial tests confirm foreign agents in the coffee. Digitalis. Concentrated." Alexander's stomach turned, but his face remained composed. "That's cardiac poison. One dose could have stopped your heart in less than an hour," Mason finished. The room suddenly felt colder. Scarlett's voice, from across the room, cracked like glass. "That's not possible. I didn't, someone must have." "Save it," Mason snapped, already signaling for the second security officer to escort her to one of the guest rooms under supervision. Emma had re-entered the room and stood frozen in the doorway as the guards approached Scarlett. "Emma," Alexander said gently, turning toward her, "please stay." She walked to him cautiously, holding Lily again. "I don't understand. What's happening?" Alexander looked at her with eyes that now held something new, something haunted. "Your daughter just prevented what could have been my murder." Emma went pale. "Oh my God. I'll need to make some calls. This isn't just a betrayal, it's a message. Someone wants me out of the picture. And they were willing to use someone inside my circle to do it." He looked again at Lily, who leaned against her mother now, exhausted by the weight of what she'd said. "I don't know what kind of people you came from," he said, voice low but full of emotion, "but they raised someone fearless." Emma's lips parted in disbelief. "I didn't raise her to be involved in anything like this." "But you raised her to tell the truth," he said. "Even when it was terrifying." There was a long silence. Then, just above a whisper, he added, "And you may have just saved more than one life." Emma felt her knees go weak. Alexander caught her elbow and steadied her gently. In that moment, as chaos began to ripple across the estate, calls being made, security tightened, lawyers summoned, time slowed between them. The line between employer and employee, millionaire and maid, began to blur. Neither of them realized it yet, but the house on the hill had just shifted. The enemy was real. And somewhere in the wreckage of fear and betrayal, something unexpected had taken root. Something like trust. Rain had begun to fall over the Weston estate by the time the lab results arrived, gentle at first, then harder, soaking the long stone driveway, washing the dust from the black iron gates. The sound of it against the windows of the drawing room was rhythmic, almost calming, but inside the house, the tension had only thickened. Alexander Weston stood at the head of the dining room table, his arms crossed over his chest, a storm of his own building behind his eyes. The private chemist, discreet, fast, and expensive, had just left after confirming what none of them wanted to believe. There was poison in the coffee. Real, lethal poison. Not just any kind, digitalis. Extracted from foxglove, a beautiful but deadly plant. Used in minute quantities, it could treat heart conditions. In larger doses, it could stop a man's heart in less than an hour. The dosage in Alexander's cup would have been fatal. Scarlett Blake sat alone in one of the smaller lounges, guarded by two private security men. Her designer suit now seemed like a costume, the dark eyeliner around her eyes smeared slightly from sweat and strain. Gone was her polished confidence. What remained was a woman cornered, unraveling. She kept muttering the same lines over and over again, like a broken record. I didn't do anything, someone's framing me. I don't even know what digitalis is. But the bottle had been found. Mason had ordered her purse searched while they waited for the lab report. Tucked inside a discreet zippered pocket was a small black dropper bottle with faint chemical residue that matched the sample from the coffee. No label. No branding. Just enough to kill. She'd tried to deny it, claim it was makeup serum. Then she'd claimed it wasn't hers at all. But the damage was done. Alexander watched the security footage pulled from the hallway camera. It didn't show the act itself. The kitchen where she'd doctored the cup had no cameras, a deliberate choice to give his staff privacy, but it showed Scarlett entering the kitchen alone with the coffee, glancing over her shoulder. Then emerging 5 minutes later with the tray in hand. Timing. Motive. Access. A child's testimony. And now, the physical evidence. It was enough. Alexander leaned against the table, staring at the paused footage on his laptop, his knuckles white. Emma stood silently behind him, her hands resting gently on Lily's shoulders. The little girl sat on the nearby couch wrapped in a fleece blanket, holding a hot cocoa someone had brought her from the staff kitchen. Her feet didn't reach the floor. She looked smaller than usual. Still brave, but quiet now, her body worn from the fear and attention. Has she said anything new? Emma asked softly, nodding toward Scarlett. Alexander didn't turn. She's spiraling. Denying. Shifting blame. Typical profile of someone caught off guard by being caught. Emma hesitated. You think she really? I mean, she would have let you die. Now he did look at her. I've worked with people like Scarlett before, he said. Polished. Calculated. They don't care about loyalty. They care about reward. If someone paid her enough, offered her position, money, power, she would have taken it without blinking. But, how could she do that and still walk around like nothing happened? Because people like that don't see lives. They see obstacles. He looked down at Lily. Until a child calls them out and ruins the plan. Emma's throat tightened. She felt a surge of pride and guilt at the same time. Her daughter had saved a man's life, but at what cost to her sense of safety? Alexander must have seen something in Emma's face, because he said gently, she's safe now. You both are. Nothing will happen to either of you. Emma nodded but couldn't find words. She just placed a kiss on Lily's head and stepped into the hallway to collect herself. Just then, Mason entered with 2 agents, men in plain clothes, well-built, with calm, unreadable expressions. Private intelligence officers, not the police. This wasn't a matter he wanted in the public eye. Not yet. They took Scarlett quietly. No handcuffs. No shouting. Just a quiet escort into the waiting black SUV that disappeared down the driveway through the pouring rain. Alexander watched from the front door. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't even feel relief. What he felt was suspicion, deep, tightening suspicion that Scarlett Blake hadn't acted alone. And he was right. Later that evening, he sat in his study, a fire lit in the stone hearth, the rain still tapping the windows like distant whispers. He poured himself a drink, whiskey, neat, but didn't touch it. His mind raced through the timeline. Scarlett had only been working for him for 4 weeks. Too short to gain access to sensitive systems. Too new to hold that much resentment. She had to be a pawn. Which meant someone else had played her. He pulled out his tablet and opened her personnel file. It had been created through a third-party recruitment agency, an elite headhunting firm based out of Chicago. Their contracts were vetted. Their background checks, supposedly bulletproof. But something felt wrong. He stared at the name of the company again, Altus Partners. Then he cross-checked it with something that made his gut clench. Last year, Altus Partners had been investigated for conflict of interest ties to his largest competitor, Rensertech. And that was the crack in the wall. He stood up abruptly and called Mason. Have someone go through Scarlett's communications. Emails, phone logs, burner numbers, everything. And get me everything you can on Altus Partners. Something's not right. She didn't work alone. Yes, sir, Mason replied without hesitation. As Alexander hung up, he turned to look out the window. The rain had stopped. But the world outside still felt unstable. Behind him, he heard quiet footsteps. Emma stood in the doorway with Lily asleep in her arms, her face soft with fatigue. She spoke gently. She asked if you were okay. Alexander swallowed. Tell her I owe her my life. Emma gave him a quiet smile. She already knows. They stood in silence for a moment, and for the first time that day, he felt something break through the heaviness of the evening, not relief. Not comfort. But the fragile warmth of being seen, not as a CEO or a headline, but as a man who nearly lost everything, and was unexpectedly saved. And somewhere deep inside, a new resolve began to harden. This wasn't over. Whoever wanted him dead had made a mistake. They'd underestimated a little girl in a denim dress. And now he would make sure they never got another chance. The following days brought quiet, but it was not peace. The mansion remained under heightened security. Surveillance was expanded, background checks rerun on every staff member, and confidential investigations launched into every contractor or service that had entered the estate in the last 6 months. Alexander Weston ran his company with military precision, but now, he ran his own home the same way. And yet, for all the activity and containment, there was something else taking root in the space between lockdown and recovery. Something more human. Emma Lawrence didn't expect to see much of Alexander after the events with Scarlett. She assumed, once the danger was contained, he'd return to his routines, meetings, business calls, jet-setting. Men like him didn't have time for maids or their daughters, even if they were grateful. But she was wrong. It started subtly. A knock at the guest house door one morning. Mason, the head of security, standing there politely. Mr. Weston asked if you and Lily would join him for breakfast today. No pressure. Just, a thank you, he said. Emma had hesitated, she hadn't even combed her hair yet, but Mason just smiled and added, he made pancakes. Burned the first 3. You'd be doing us all a favor. It was awkward at first. Lily clung to Emma's side like ivy. Alexander, for his part, was trying. He'd swapped his usual tailored suit for a white Oxford shirt and jeans. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows. He looked younger. Softer. Like the man behind the title. He made her coffee, insisted she sit down, even let Lily help pour the syrup. Emma watched him closely. Not suspiciously, but curiously. Who was this man who could run a tech empire and also stand patiently while an 8-year-old decided how much butter she wanted on her toast? That breakfast turned into a routine. Once. Then twice. Then it became normal. Sometimes Lily would run up the back steps to Alexander's office just to say goodnight. He started keeping little treats in his desk for her: books, puzzles, colored pencils. They played chess once. She beat him. He swore it was a fluke. She insisted he owed her ice cream. But it wasn't just Lily. Emma found herself being pulled into his world, slowly and without warning. He started asking her questions, not just about housework, but about life. About how she ended up here. About her past. She told him the truth. She had married young. Fell in love with a man who dreamed big but never got the chance to live it out. He'd been hit by a drunk driver while coming home from work. One moment, her life had been full, messy, imperfect, but full. The next, it had collapsed. Debt had followed. Bills piled up. Her job at the bank couldn't stretch far enough. She'd lost her home. Moved in with an aunt. Applied for any job she could find. The Weston estate had been a last resort, dignified, clean, quiet. She hadn't expected to stay. And she'd never expected to belong. Alexander listened without interrupting. When she faltered, he waited. When she cried, just once, quietly, he didn't comfort her with empty words. He simply sat there. Present. A man who understood loss in his own way. He spoke, too. Not about the empire he'd built, or the millions he'd made, but about his childhood, how he was raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs and barely made rent. How he spent afternoons in the public library because it was the only warm place after school. How he never wanted to feel powerless again. They sat by the fireplace in the evening sometimes, after Lily had gone to bed. The flames casting gold across their faces. A silence would settle between them, not awkward, but familiar. Like 2 people who no longer had to perform. There was a night, cool and still, when Emma asked him, "Are you always like this with people you employ?" Alexander had looked at her, surprised by the question. Then he smiled, not with arrogance, but with something deeper. Something hesitant. "No," he said quietly. "Only with people I trust." Emma hadn't known what to say to that. So she'd said nothing. But her chest had tightened, and her hands had started to shake, just a little. One afternoon, Emma walked past the garden and found Alexander and Lily sitting cross-legged on the grass. He was teaching her how to fold paper airplanes. They'd made a dozen, all badly shaped, and every time one failed to fly more than a few feet, Lily would burst into laughter and Alexander would mock sigh in defeat. Emma had watched from the path for a long time, unnoticed. She realized something then, something sharp and terrifying. She was falling for him. Not in a fantasy, fairy tale way. Not because he was handsome or rich, though he was both. But because he had slowly opened a part of himself she hadn't expected to see. He was kind to her daughter. He respected her words. He looked at her, not through her. And for the first time in years, she felt not invisible, but seen. That night, Alexander knocked on the door of the guest house. Emma had just finished folding laundry. She opened it, surprised, and found him standing there with 2 cups of tea in his hands. "I couldn't sleep," he said. "Thought maybe you couldn't either." They sat on the porch together. No words at first. Just the night sounds, crickets, a breeze, the hush of far-off cars on the hill. After a while, Alexander said, "I keep replaying it in my head. What would have happened if she hadn't said anything? If she'd stayed quiet?" Emma took a sip of tea, then replied, "She almost didn't. She was afraid you wouldn't believe her." "I might not have," he admitted. "I trust too slowly. And I've let the wrong people in before." "Me too," she whispered. There was another silence. Then Alexander looked at her and said, almost carefully, but this time, "I think I let the right ones in." Emma didn't respond, not right away. Her throat felt tight. Her chest hurt. But not in a bad way. She turned her head to look at him. The porch light caught his eyes, those deep brown eyes that had seen the world from heights she'd never known. But they were human now. Quiet. Searching. Emma didn't move. But she didn't pull away, either. And Alexander Weston, the man behind the empire, the name behind the billions, sat beside her, not as a CEO, not as a hero, not as someone she served, but as a man who, for the first time in a very long time, had found something he hadn't known he was missing. Warmth. Trust. And the beginnings of love. The peace didn't last. For a while, the estate had felt almost like a hidden world, quiet, protected, suspended in time. Alexander had stopped taking trips to the city. He moved meetings online, ignored headlines, cancelled 2 international summits. He didn't say it aloud, but Emma understood, something had shifted in him. He had become more rooted, more human, and more watchful. But there was still unfinished business. Scarlett's arrest had made waves, though the press had been kept in the dark. Officially, it was written off as a breach of internal trust and a violation of conduct. No one mentioned poison. No one dared mention murder. But Alexander hadn't stopped digging. Mason's investigation into the recruitment firm that had placed Scarlett led to a maze of corporate shells and dead-end addresses. Altus Partners had quietly dissolved just days after her arrest. Their records were incomplete. Digital trails erased. Too clean. Too fast. One night, well past midnight, Alexander stood in his office, surrounded by dim monitors and the soft whir of machines. Rain tapped against the windows again, always rain, like a warning. He stared at his screen. At a message received hours earlier. Anonymous. Encrypted. The subject line read. Look within. Your enemy sits across from you. No signature. No trace. But it confirmed what he had already begun to suspect, Scarlett was only a distraction. A pawn. The real betrayal was closer. He started from the top. Re-examining board meeting transcripts, security logs, travel patterns. Most of his inner circle had been with him for years. Trusted, loyal. Or so he believed. But as he combed through the data, one pattern began to emerge, small, almost invisible, but there, a series of private calendar deletions tied to his chief operating officer, Michael Hayes. Hayes had been with him since the early years. Smart, charismatic, unshakably calm under pressure. The kind of executive investors loved. He was Alexander's second-in-command, the man who had handled most of the operational decisions for Weston Dynamics while Alexander focused on vision and innovation. But now he looked like a ghost in the machine. Several deleted meetings coincided with financial dips in Rencerteca's stock, followed immediately by suspicious recoveries. Internal reports that Hayes had flagged as irrelevant were later found to contain proprietary security breaches. Worst of all, Mason traced a burner phone used to contact Altus Partners back to a service registered in Hayes's name 6 months earlier. The betrayal was surgical. Calculated. And devastating. Alexander didn't speak to anyone for hours. He simply sat at his desk, trying to accept that someone who had stood beside him for over a decade had orchestrated an attempt on his life, and nearly succeeded. He thought about Emma. He thought about Lily. He thought about the way Lily had walked into that dining room, her voice shaking, and told him not to drink the coffee. She had stopped the attack, but the war wasn't over. The next morning, Alexander gathered his leadership team for an emergency meeting. Hayes arrived as usual, dressed in navy and gray, freshly shaved, calm as ever. "I assume this is about the Scarlett incident," he asked casually, taking his seat. Alexander stared at him across the table. "In part." He clicked a remote. A screen came to life behind him, displaying a timeline of phone records, email headers, and security logs, each point connected with thin red lines. Mason stood at the side, silent, arms crossed. Hayes turned to look, his face unreadable. "What is this?" "It's what betrayal looks like," Alexander said coldly. For a moment, no one moved. Then Hayes leaned back in his chair and let out a slow, deliberate breath. "I was wondering when you'd put it together." The room chilled. "You admit it," Alexander said. "Why not?" Hayes replied, his voice smooth, unhurried. "You've already got your smoking gun. What difference does it make now? You tried to kill me." "I tried to save the company," Hayes said, standing now, hands still in his pockets. "You became a weakness, Alex. Soft. Distracted. Tying up resources in ethical restrictions and charity contracts while Rensertech outmaneuvered us at every turn. I offered them intel in exchange for partnership. I didn't know Scarlett would go that far. She poisoned me. And that wasn't part of the plan. They were supposed to push you out, force a board vote. Not, assassinate you." Alexander stepped closer, his voice low and furious. "You handed them a loaded gun and walked away." Hayes shrugged. "I expected you to be smarter." It was Mason who moved first, swift and controlled, stepping behind Hayes and snapping the cuffs on his wrists. Hayes didn't resist. He only smiled at Alexander as they led him away. "Enjoy your little fairy tale, Weston," he said over his shoulder. "Let's see how long it lasts." When the doors closed, Alexander felt the room spin. He'd been betrayed by the man who once stood beside him through every major expansion. But he also knew, this was the final piece. With Hayes gone, the leak was sealed. The board supported Alexander without question. Rensertech's connections to the poisoning were documented and quietly passed to federal investigators. A multi-million-dollar contract with the government, once threatened, was finalized within days. But Alexander didn't feel victorious. He felt hollow. That night, he found Emma on the back patio, watering the potted flowers she and Lily had planted together last week. Her hair was pulled into a loose braid. Her face was tired. But when she turned to him, her smile lit something in his chest he didn't know he still had. "You look like you've been through a war," she said. "I have." She set the watering can down. "Is it over?" He nodded slowly. "The worst of it." She walked to him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her. "Then maybe it's time to stop fighting." He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her. At the woman who had unknowingly become his anchor. At the girl who had saved his life. At the home he didn't know he'd needed. "I don't know how to stop," he said quietly. "Then learn," she whispered. "With us." In the distance, the sun dipped behind the hills, casting the world in deep amber. And for the first time since the betrayal began, Alexander felt something stronger than vengeance. He felt hope that it was strange how quickly the house returned to silence after everything. No more legal teams. No more secret meetings. No more agents in dark suits patrolling the hallways. The storm had passed, but the stillness left behind felt delicate, like something could break it if one breathed too loudly. Alexander found himself lingering in rooms he used to pass through without notice. The music room, the greenhouse, the small library on the second floor. He had spent years building a kingdom of glass and steel, only to discover he didn't know what silence actually sounded like. He wasn't used to space feeling empty. The days no longer blurred into boardrooms and stock prices. Time slowed. Lily's laughter had replaced the buzz of his phone. Emma's footsteps had become more familiar than the hum of conference calls. He noticed her in ways that went beyond gratitude. The way her hand absent-mindedly moved to Lily's back whenever she passed her. The way she tied her apron twice, just to make sure it wouldn't loosen. The way her eyes narrowed in amusement whenever he pretended he didn't know how to fold laundry. She hadn't asked for his attention. She hadn't expected it. That made it all the more impossible to ignore. One evening, after Lily had fallen asleep curled up beside a storybook, Emma walked outside to find Alexander standing by the pool, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, one hand tucked in his pocket, the other holding a glass of something untouched. The sky was soft with the fading light of dusk, painted in orange and rose and blue, and the first star blinked above the line of trees. "You look like you're waiting for something," she said softly as she approached. He turned, startled only briefly, and then smiled. "Maybe I am." Emma hesitated. "Do you want to be alone?" He shook his head and gestured to the lounge chair next to his. She joined him, tucking her legs underneath her. For a while, they said nothing. The air was cool, but not cold. The kind of temperature that carried memories with it. The kind that made people think of things they hadn't let themselves feel in a long time. Alexander finally broke the silence. "When my mother died," he began, "I didn't cry. I was 17. Too proud. Too angry. Too convinced I had to grow up instantly. Everyone kept saying how strong I was. How mature. But inside I was just, gone." Emma listened, her eyes on the pool, the surface rippling gently from the wind. She worked herself to death, basically. Retail by day, diner by night. She never complained. "I thought success would make it all worth it somehow. Like I could prove her sacrifice mattered." He paused. "But the more I built, the more I lost. People fell away. I pushed them. Or they wanted things. Or they wanted to be seen with the name, not the man. I didn't even notice when I stopped trusting people. I just assumed that was the cost." Emma turned to look at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "And now?" "Now?" He exhaled. "Now there's a girl in a denim dress who made me realize my life was about to end, and a woman who reminded me what it means to feel safe again." Emma's throat tightened. She looked away quickly, pretending to smooth the edge of the cushion. "I'm just a maid, Alexander." "No," he said, almost sharply. "You're not. Don't ever say that again." She blinked. "You're a survivor. You're a mother. You're someone who walked into a stranger's house and gave it warmth without even trying." Her voice broke slightly when she replied. "I was just trying to stay afloat." "Then maybe we both were." He turned toward her now, fully, his gaze intense but not overwhelming. Not demanding. Just present. Unshakably present. "You're not invisible here, Emma. Not to me. Not anymore." She felt a tear slip down her cheek and quickly wiped it away, embarrassed. But he didn't look away. He reached forward gently and took her hand. "I don't know what this is between us," he said, "but I know it matters. And I'm tired of pretending it doesn't." Emma held his gaze. She didn't speak, but her silence was answer enough. Her fingers tightened slightly around his. A moment passed, quiet and fragile and full. Then, soft footsteps echoed behind them. "Mommy?" Emma turned to see Lily standing in the glass doorway, rubbing her eyes sleepily. "I had a dream you weren't here," she said, her voice small. Emma stood immediately. "I'm right here, sweetheart. I'll come tuck you back in." Alexander rose with her, and Lily looked up at him. "Will you be here in the morning too?" He crouched to her level. "If you want me to be." Lily nodded, sleepy but certain. "Okay. You can stay." He smiled. They walked back into the house together, Lily between them, one small hand in each of theirs. That night, as Emma kissed her daughter goodnight and turned to find Alexander waiting just beyond the doorway, she saw something in his eyes that made her heart ache. Hope. Not just for himself. But for the life he was beginning to imagine. A life that looked very different from the empire he'd built. It wasn't built on steel and glass. It was built on laughter in quiet kitchens. On bedtime stories. On second chances. And for the first time in years, Alexander Weston allowed himself to believe he could have it. The media storm couldn't be contained forever. It started as a whisper, murmurs in business columns about sudden staff changes at Weston Dynamics, speculation over the mysterious disappearance of COO Michael Hayes, and the quiet termination of a high-profile secretary with no explanation. Rumors filled the vacuum where facts were carefully hidden. But then came the leak. An anonymous whistleblower dropped a cache of internal documents and time-stamped communications onto a journalist's encrypted tip line. Within 24 hours, headlines exploded across every major outlet. Attempted corporate assassination at Weston Estate, poison, espionage, betrayal. The story was too cinematic not to run. A billionaire nearly murdered by his own staff. A corporate mole working for a rival company. A young girl, the daughter of a maid, who'd saved his life. It was the perfect headline cocktail: money, danger, and an unlikely hero. Reporters camped outside the estate gates. Helicopters hovered during press hours. Journalists stalked former employees and current vendors. Everyone wanted a sound bite, a glimpse, a scandal. But Alexander refused to play by their rules. Instead, he did something no one expected. He invited the world in, on his own terms. The day of the press conference was cool and bright, the lawn of the Weston estate perfectly trimmed, white chairs lined in orderly rows beneath a temporary pavilion. A podium stood at the center, simple and unadorned, flanked by two flags, one national, one bearing the Weston Dynamics logo. Cameras were already rolling when Alexander stepped onto the small platform. He wore a charcoal gray suit and no tie, his sleeves slightly rolled as if to remind everyone this wasn't just a speech, it was a moment of truth. He began without preamble. A month ago, someone inside my home tried to take my life. The crowd shifted. Even seasoned reporters looked up from their phones. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a calculated act of corporate espionage, orchestrated by individuals who believed that power and ambition justified the cost of a human life. His voice was calm, steady, but beneath it, there was steel. And they would have succeeded, if it weren't for the courage of a child. Lily Lawrence. There was a collective gasp, followed by a ripple of applause. She's 8 years old. She saw something she didn't understand, but she spoke up anyway. She saved me. Not just my body, but something more important. She reminded me that no amount of power is worth having if it isn't grounded in truth. He paused, scanning the crowd. And that's why I'm standing here today. Not to talk about stock. Not to spin the narrative. But to say this: we cannot lead with fear. We cannot trade integrity for convenience. And we must stop pretending that the people who clean our floors and raise our children and hold our doors are any less vital than the ones who sit in glass towers. He motioned to the side, and Emma stepped onto the platform, holding Lily's hand. Cameras flashed wildly. Emma wore a simple navy dress. Lily, in her blue denim jumper, clutched a small stuffed rabbit and stood proudly beside her mother. Alexander looked down at them, not as a CEO, not as a headline, but as a man profoundly changed. I owe my life to them, he said. So today, I'm announcing the creation of the Lilly Foundation, a permanent trust under Weston Dynamics that will provide education and housing support to children of service workers, beginning here in California. The applause was thunderous now. And one more thing, he added, smiling slightly. Emma Lawrence has agreed to step into a new role here at Weston. She'll serve as Director of Internal Well-Being and Security, overseeing ethics, staff culture, and protection across all levels of our company. She will report directly to me. Emma's eyes widened slightly. She hadn't known he'd announce it publicly, but he reached out and took her hand, and her breath caught in her throat. It was real. It was happening. He didn't let go. After the press conference, reporters clamored for quotes, but Alexander disappeared into the estate with Emma and Lily before anyone could corner them. Inside, the house felt quieter than it had in weeks. Not because it was empty, but because, at last, it felt whole. In the private study upstairs, Alexander loosened his collar and sat on the edge of the desk, watching Lily color at the table near the window. Emma stood beside him, still stunned by the morning's events. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. He looked up. "Which part?" "All of it. The speech. The job. The foundation. Me." "I know," he said. "But I wanted to." She shook her head in disbelief. "People will talk. Say I took advantage of the situation. That I used my daughter to save a life," he interrupted. "Let them talk." She swallowed, her voice growing softer. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." There was a long pause. Then Emma whispered, "I still don't understand why me." He stepped closer. Not to convince her, but to make her see what he'd already accepted. "Because when everything else fell apart," he said, "you were the one thing that didn't." She looked up at him then, her blue eyes wide, unguarded. "Emma," he said, almost a breath, "I don't just want you in this house. I want you in my life. In every part of it." The moment was quiet. Sacred. She didn't speak, but when he reached for her, she let herself fall forward into his arms, and it felt like the final piece sliding into place. In the corner, Lily peeked over her coloring book. "Are you two gonna kiss or what?" Emma pulled back, laughing through her tears. "Lily." Alexander grinned. "She's definitely your daughter." The three of them laughed together, and for the first time, it wasn't a strange picture, a billionaire, a maid, and a child in a blue jumper. It wasn't an accident or a scandal or a story for the tabloids. It was a beginning. Not one built on image or power. But on truth. On choice. On love. The seasons shifted gently over the hills of the Weston estate. Summer softened into early autumn, and the sharp greens of the trees began to melt into tones of gold and rust. The air became crisper in the mornings, and the sunsets came earlier, casting longer shadows across the land. Life at the estate no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like home. The chaos of the past had gradually faded into memory. Scarlett had been sentenced to 12 years in prison. Michael Hayes was awaiting federal trial. Rencertec had lost its government contracts and was undergoing major restructuring. Whispers of the poisoning scandal still lingered in corners of the internet, but the public had moved on, drawn to newer stories, fresher headlines. Alexander Weston had not moved on. He had transformed. The man who once lived behind glass walls, unreachable and efficient, had let the world see him bleed, and survive. And through that breaking, something unexpected had taken root: humility, gratitude, clarity. But none of it would have happened without her. Emma. She had taken her new role with grace and quiet strength, creating real change within Weston dynamics. She brought empathy into boardrooms, restructured staff protocols, set up mental health resources for all levels of employees. She refused to play politics. She spoke with honesty, even when it made the room fall silent. Alexander watched her work with awe. And every night, when the meetings ended and the phones were silent, he returned home, not to a penthouse, not to a bachelor's emptiness, but to warmth. To the soft laughter of a little girl brushing her teeth with foam on her chin. To the sound of Emma reading bedtime stories. To the comfort of quiet dinners where nothing had to be said to be understood. He had everything he needed. But not everything he wanted. One evening, Lily came running into the study where Alexander sat reviewing some final notes on an upcoming merger. She wore her favorite pajamas, light blue with little white clouds, and her hair was in a half-finished braid, clearly an impatient job done by Emma. "Alex," she shouted, her bare feet pattering across the hardwood. He looked up instantly, alert. "What's wrong?" She skidded to a stop beside his chair and leaned in close, as if telling a secret. "You forgot to say goodnight." He smiled and put his tablet down. "That's a serious offense." She nodded solemnly. "I was almost asleep, and then I remembered, you're not really my dad." He froze for half a heartbeat. She looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. "But I was wondering, can you be?" The question landed with more weight than she could know. Alexander's breath caught in his chest. He knelt down in front of her, hands gently resting on her arms. "Do you want me to be?" he asked, voice low. Lily didn't hesitate. "Yes. I already tell people you are. But Mommy said that's not official." He chuckled, though his throat was tight. "Well, maybe it's time we make it official." Lily beamed and ran back toward her bedroom, yelling, "Mom." He said yes. Emma appeared moments later in the hallway, eyes wide with surprise. "What did she ask you?" Alexander stepped toward her, his heart beating faster than it had during any hostile takeover or financial risk. "She asked if I could be her father. And I said yes." Emma blinked, stunned. "Alex." He took her hands. "But I want to make something else official too." And then, slowly, he dropped to one knee. The hallway was quiet. The only sound was the distant wind rustling the leaves outside the windows. The soft hum of home. "I never believed I'd find someone who could break through the walls I built. I never thought I'd be saved by a child, or fall in love with the woman who raised her. But I did. And it changed everything." Emma stood frozen, her breath catching. Alexander pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it. Inside was a ring, simple, timeless. A single diamond, delicate and perfect. "Emma Lawrence, will you marry me?" Tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them. She dropped to her knees in front of him, smiling through the tears, nodding before her voice could even form words. "Yes," she whispered. "God, yes." They stayed there for a long moment, in the middle of the hallway, arms around each other, their foreheads pressed together. Lily peeked out from her bedroom, giggling. "I knew it," she said, before running back to her bed. The wedding was small. No headlines. No paparazzi. Just a quiet garden ceremony under a canopy of maple trees beginning to blush with red. Close friends, loyal employees, and a few family members gathered in a circle. Lily walked Emma down the aisle, proudly holding her hand the whole way. When they exchanged vows, Alexander didn't speak of wealth or legacy. He spoke of love. Of safety. Of the courage it took to build a home not from concrete, but from trust. Emma's vows were soft and steady. She thanked him for seeing her. For seeing her daughter. For choosing them when he didn't have to. That night, they danced in the moonlight, barefoot on the stone patio behind the house, while Lily twirled circles around them in her white flower girl dress. There was no music. Just laughter. Just joy. Years later, people would still speak of the Weston scandal. The poisoning. The betrayal. The billion-dollar contract that changed the tech industry. But the real story wasn't in the headlines. It was here, in a home rebuilt from brokenness. In a child's voice, brave enough to speak the truth. In a man powerful enough to listen. In a woman strong enough to love again. It was a story of survival. Of second chances. Of choosing love, not because it was safe, but because it was real. And that, finally, was everything. That there's something quietly powerful about how this story ends, not with vengeance, not with victory banners or media applause, but with softness. With human connection. In a world obsessed with power, wealth, and performance, Alexander's journey is about unlearning. Unlearning the belief that strength means silence. That trust is a liability. That success must come at the cost of intimacy. His transformation isn't loud, but it's profound. He begins the story behind glass, untouchable, armored. He ends it on his knees, offering a ring, asking to be chosen not for his name, but for his heart. Emma, in her quiet strength, is the grounding force of the story. She's not a woman who needs saving, she's a survivor, a protector, a mother. Her dignity doesn't come from grand speeches or wealth, but from resilience and grace in the face of everything she's endured. She doesn't chase love. She earns it without ever asking for it. And Lily, what can be said about her that isn't already written between every line? She is the compass. The spark. The embodiment of truth spoken plainly and without fear. In a room full of adults, it's the child who sees clearly. It's the child who speaks. And in doing so, she changes everything. This isn't just a story about betrayal or romance, it's a story about the courage to love again after the world has broken you. About finding family in unexpected places. And about how sometimes, the most important lives aren't saved with guns or guards, but with a single whispered sentence from a child who refuses to look away. And maybe that's the real lesson. Love doesn't always enter with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives in bare feet, with a messy braid, and a warning not to drink the coffee.